Welcome to The Pick List, the podcast for curious food industry minds.
Every week, we bring you our pick of articles from the world of food and grocery retail and explore what they tell us about how our food industry is changing in these extraordinary times.
We chat about the major news from nationals and big trade titles, but we also love unearthing gems from niche publications and sharing brilliant, quirky food stories that change the way we think about the food we eat and produce.
I'm Julia Glotz.
And I'm Laura Ryan.
It's great to have you with us. Let's start the show.
Hi Julia, it's episode 36 of The Pick List. Have you had a good week so far?
Hello, Laura. Yes, a very good week. Thank you. Another busy week of writing for me. The deadline is looming later this week. So, yes, I'm chained to my desk and churning out a lot of copy. How have you been?
Yeah, good week, thank you. You'll be ready for a nice G&T by the time the weekend comes, I know that. Yeah, I'm having a good week actually. I've started a chunk of consultancy working with Global Meat Alliance, which I jointly chair, or getting ready for the UN Food Systems Summit. So we're running our first UN dialogue next month, so we're just getting arranged for that. So it's very exciting. On the podcast this week, we have a great guest.
We have indeed. We're joined by Jack Hamilton, who is CEO of Mash Direct. Jack is a brilliant guest who brought us some really interesting insight into how Mash Direct has experienced the past 12 months, how they've navigated the pandemic, what shopper behaviour changes they've seen, and of course he's also picked some really, really interesting articles for us to discuss from The Economist and The Atlantic.
Should we start the show?
Jack, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Julia. It's such a pleasure to be here with you and Laura.
Why don't you briefly introduce yourself and tell our listeners who you are, what you do, and how you're connected to the food industry?
No worries. I'm Jack Hamilton. I'm the CEO here at Mash Direct. We are a sixth generation family farm here on the farm that I'm standing on here in Cumber in County Down. And what we do is we grow the veg, we steam cook it, we pack it, we do it the whole way through and have it branded on shelves. We started back in 2004, and we're now and we started supplying into two local convenience stores back then, our two local C stores here in Killay and Clinchy. We've since gone from there to supply over 10,000 stores right the way around UK and Ireland, as well as exporting from the farm here as well.
Great. And you brought such interesting articles for us to discuss, including about some interesting changes to shopper behaviour as well. Before we jump into those, I'd just love to quiz you a little bit about what the past 12 months have been like for you, what changes you have seen in shopper behaviour in the categories that you're in, and what your expectations are for 2021.
Wow. Yeah, it's been a really challenging year for everyone. I mean, farming is one of those things where everyone is eternal optimists in our industry because you have to be. You've just got to simply go, the weather's going to be better tomorrow, and we're all going to keep going. I mean, it's been a challenge. I suppose the main things for us in the last 12 months were fundamental to us, the health and safety of our team. While running a factory here, lots of people have had their challenges, so we're really happy and proud to say that we've had no cluster cases here on site, and everyone's got their health. Which is the most important thing for us generally in the industry. It was a really crazy time to try and track and try and understand what was happening out there. From panic buying right at the start, and potatoes being one of the things that for some reason was absolutely flying off the shelves. And I wish I had the insight to know exactly what was driving those consumer behaviors in the first few weeks that we're now just starting to overlap, which is going to be really interesting for the like comparisons in 2021. So this is just getting into that time period now. So we went from there into kind of the most strange news articles dictating consumer behavior. I mean, I think for us, when we saw the really biggest shift of everything was Boris going into hospital. That really changed the way we saw our sales go. Suddenly, all of a sudden, people didn't really want to be out in supermarkets, and people took it a lot more seriously. And it seemed to be that instant we saw a direct impact with a bit of a slowdown. Obviously, food service for us, we supply into food service, so that stopped very quickly. We were able to pivot into e-commerce, so that more than made up for it. And then we are basically by the end of the year, with all of the changes we made here, we were back in growth again by the end of the year. And that was mainly driven through consumer behavior, looking for provenance, wanting to know where their food came from, wanting more local food, and as well as that, consumers focusing on health, so focusing on fresh, convenient vegetables, which kept us very busy. So we created 40 new jobs through the whole thing as well here here on the farm. So it's been a hectic year, and what 2021 is going to look like, we don't really know. But we've hired 3 new people into our NBD team who are here to tell me exactly what we're looking at. And yeah, they're a brilliant team who we've just brought on. And basically what we're looking at is how the kind of post-COVID restaurant kitchens are going to look when they can't have quite as many people in the restaurants cooking. So they're going to need some of their preparation to be done in advance. And we're anticipating a lot of de-skilling of restaurants, especially in tight city spaces. So we're looking into that, and we're helping out a lot of restaurants as we stand to help food service get back on its feet with kitchens being in a limited capacity.
That's so interesting. And I know we'll have an opportunity to dive into some of these themes in a little bit more detail later in our discussion as well. We also want to quiz you a little bit on your reading habits, though, because, of course, the pick list is all about highlighting and sharing interesting finds from across the food media and the national media. Tell us a bit about what publications you read on a regular basis and how you keep up to date with what's happening in the industry.
For me, keeping up with the news just means keeping up with, I think, a lot of the same publications that listeners and viewers of the show will be used to. The Grocer, Food Manufacturer, Fresh Produce Journal, here Irish Farmers Journal as well as all the national press, just seeing what's going on in the food world. Where we are in this part of the world, we've got a slight advantage as well, in that because Northern Ireland is so focused on the food industry and it's such a big market here, that our local press is really good for keeping up to date on general food news. So the Belfast Telegraph, the Irish News, the Irish Times are all fantastic. The business section is dominated by the stories going on in the food press, which is fantastic. And then, of course, keeping up to date on LinkedIn, on Twitter, understanding what's going on there and having lists through there. I was actually keeping up to date with Julia's Twitter, is where I saw the trim when the weekly email list started coming out, which has then brought me on to the pick list as well. So it all feeding in nicely, and I definitely steal a lot of ideas from both of those and pass them off as articles that I've just casually come across myself, as if I'm reading all of these publications. I mean, I think like those kind of weekly, daily email lists going out has been a real change in journalism, which makes it so easy for people in my position to pretend like we're keeping up. Like, there's the Jack Blanchard who did Politico back in the day and stuff like that. I can pretend like I know what's happening in Westminster, and with the trim and with the pick list, I can pretend like I'm completely up to date with the food industry as well.
Fantastic. We love to hear that. Glad to be of service. Now, Jack, tell us about your first pick for us.
Yeah, my first pick came from The Economist this week. It's an article on it's called "Digital Engagement is Shaping Manufacturing." And I found it interesting because they're taking it kind of one step further than where we'd normally anticipate that goes. I mean, there's the normal stories in around how much e-commerce is shaping behaviors, which the article gets into, and then it says, there's more obviously business to consumer activity, which is meaning that everything's getting a little bit more personalized, and it gets into pet food and explaining how the personalization is coming. But then it gets into the step after that, which I think will be really interesting looking into the future. And that's where the line starts to get blurred between product and service. And essentially what it's talking about is consumer to manufacturer information, where you've got big data coming through, you've got AI getting involved. And essentially it's giving real-time information from consumers back to the manufacturer, so that the innovation process and manufacture are happening at a hugely accelerated speed. And what it talks about, one of the examples it gives, which is not necessarily the food industry, but I thought was really interesting, is it talks about robot vacuum cleaners in China, and talking a lot about how this is all being driven out of China. And essentially the vacuum cleaners were initially pitched to people who were making a lot more money, high net worth people. And they actually found that demand for these products was coming from people on much lower incomes. So they then use that information to feed through to the manufacturers and say, if you can manufacture this for a much more affordable price, there's a much bigger market out there for you. So the manufacturer then changed, and it started selling the product before the manufacturer had even completed the process of manufacturing it. So the pre-orders were already there, and the manufacturer was already being led by the consumer data. And I found that fascinating, for us to learn from the food industry perspective, to say, if you can master consumer data and you can really understand what consumers are looking for, you could even accelerate the NPD process to give the retailers peace of mind to say, look, we can already prove the demand is there, and we can start to make things way in advance of when the anticipation is there. I mean, it's kind of dream ticket out there for NPD teams, but I found it really interesting that it's actually happening now with AI in China.
I love the article, and I was really intrigued by the way it started off talking about pet food as well, and the fact that, although the article's China driven, that there was data, was it just last week, that we've bought over 3 million more pets in the last 12 months in the UK, and there'll be a huge market for personalisation in that, and then how this is led. And I was just really intrigued as well about how I wonder, and I was keen to pick your brains really, Jack. Do you think as consumers we're more open to sharing data? Because stuff like this, it feels quite okay, to talk about maybe your food habits, or as you say, the vacuum cleaner example in the article, that the mass public are just used to it. We're on social platforms that are really, our data's getting shared anyway, so there's maybe not the barriers that used to be, and now the technology's in place. Do you maybe see that as well, that I guess it's more open, and the example you brought from the article?
Absolutely. I think consumers are really open to sharing their data and sharing their information, perhaps maybe too open to share information at times, certainly with social media. That's something that retailers are very accustomed to, having the EPOS data, or even having dunnhumby or any of that information, having it all come through, and in qualitative and quantitative information. So I think it's something that consumers opt into, whether or not they're fully aware of how much information they're consciously giving away, or how much they're giving away just through the links they're clicking on Facebook or Instagram or TikTok. I'm not quite sure if the consumer's fully aware of how much information they're giving away, but it's certainly out there. And with that information, then manufacturers are able to make products that fit in more with their lifestyle.
I think it'll be interesting to see what will happen with consumer sentiment around privacy and sharing information. My sense is that as long as there is a fair exchange of value, yes, you're sharing your data, but you have visibility on who you're sharing the data with and to what level, and you get a benefit out of this because now I might be able to tailor my products and services more to you. That I think that works. I think if there's a shared exchange of value, you can make that work. I think it's more problematic if, as a consumer, you feel like your data is feeding into a black box and the manufacturer is getting a vastly better NPD process out of this, but you're not getting the benefit back. I suppose a lot of this, though, is about sort of looking at bigger trends. And I was interested to see to what extent you have found that doing e-commerce gives you new data and different levels of data to then inform your NPD processes. Have you been able to start doing anything like that? Are you seeing things in that data that you wouldn't be getting from other sources of data, for example?
We're seeing consumers behave differently than how we ever thought our customers were. Our name is Mash Direct, and the vast majority of products that we make and sell are started off as Mash products, and now we're seeing through the pandemic, especially, we saw much more of a polarization of how people consume throughout the week. So the start of the weeks being more on the healthier, the root veggies, the carrot and parsnip, and those kind of products, and then towards the end of the week moving more gradually into beer battered chips and beer battered onion rings, and those are more indulgent products. And we're selling through major retailers, and we're selling through convenience stores. We don't necessarily understand that pattern and see that happening through, but we're able to see that really clearly with the patterns of how people are buying veg boxes from us. And we wouldn't have had that insight without the direct to consumer avenue that we launched there last year.
Julia, what's your first pick this week?
My first pick this week is from The Telegraph, and it's an article titled Iceland Goes Upmarket with New Fresh Food Chain. This is about Swift, the new convenience store format that Iceland is launching. It's a really interesting development in its own right. I also had to pick it because the first store is opening in Newcastle this week, and it's literally about 15 minutes from where I live. So there's a strong local angle in this story for me. We're recording this on Wednesday, so it's before the store has opened, and I haven't seen it, but I will be going over the weekend, and I'm really excited to see what they've done with the store. Because there are several interesting angles to this story, which this Telegraph article explores. What we know about Swift at this stage is quite limited, but we know it's a convenience format. It's a much smaller format than your typical Iceland store, but it will nevertheless carry about 3,000 SKUs. It will have fresh as well as frozen ranges. There will be alcohol and tobacco, as you would expect in a convenience store. And food to go and ready meals will be a big focus. There's also some interesting speculation in this piece about what they're going to be doing with checkouts. We've obviously seen a lot of innovation recently around that whole checkout experience, and also whether they'll be offering home delivery from those stores. The bit that really caught my eye, though, is the store layout. How this store will look in practice, I think, will be very, very interesting. Iceland is describing the store layout as novel and something that will break down traditional divides between frozen and chilled food, which I think sounds really intriguing. Because the frozen category, of course, has done very well over the past 12 months, but it's for many years tried to attract a wider range of shoppers for a wider range of shopping missions, and it's tried to make the frozen aisle more of a destination in store. And that has proved really difficult, not least because frozen is typically right at the back of the store. So with some of the big lucrative shopper missions like lunch to go, meal for tonight, anything that's a little bit more inspiration and impulse driven, it's been really tough for the frozen guys to get a look in, because it's basically all happening at the other end of the store in the chilled aisles. And I think that's particularly true in convenience. If you go to your average supermarket run convenience store on the high street, it's all optimized around food for now, food for later, and it's chilled, chilled, chilled. And somewhere, at the back of the store, you might get a freezer cabinet, but that's about it. So is Iceland potentially going to be creating an environment where frozen can compete much more effectively with chilled for some of those shopper missions? And then in turn, what's the knock-on effect going to be on NPD potentially, but also the way that other convenience formats will evolve? Because this is such a big time for convenience, a big time of change around shopper habits. And there's a lot of uncertainty around what will happen to shopper behaviour once lockdown restrictions start lifting, particularly in categories like food to go. And I suppose if demand remains a little bit unpredictable, there will be big concerns about waste in some of these categories. So getting frozen to play a bigger role in those shopper missions in those categories could be an interesting solution to that problem. But yes, I'm very, very intrigued to see exactly what they're going to do and practice, and whether, breaking down those barriers between fresh and frozen and chilled and frozen is going to open up these categories to frozen brands much more than is currently the case. Jack, what did you make of it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really interested to hear your thoughts when you get into the store as well, to see what they're revealing. It's a really interesting concept to launch a store and give very little information on kind of what it's going to look like, and there's lots of teasing coming out. So it's exciting to hear a new concept out there, and it'll be really interesting to see if they're positioning themselves, if Iceland are positioning Swift to go for shoppers and try to attract people who maybe would have gone to a Tesco or even a Waitrose, or if they're positioning themselves to maybe go for consumers who maybe would have shopped in Aldi or Lidl otherwise, to see what type of market they're going into. It sounds like they're trying to get people to trade up, which is interesting because they've got their food warehouse concept, which is doing really well. So it'll be interesting to see what this new move is, and to see if it's something where they're looking to increase the presence of the Iceland own label, or if they're going to use brands to come in so that they can compete against some of the other more upmarket retailers out there.
I would agree with that, Jack. And when I saw Richard Walker's tweet about this few days ago, I thought he was actually stood outside a Quick Fit getting his tyre changed, because the branding is is so blue and bold, very unlike Iceland or Food Warehouse. I actually thought, is he getting a tyre change? I thought, no, he's not. They've bought it. And then I thought, oh, they've bought this with a view to rebrand it into an Iceland type format. So the fact, my initial reaction was, oh right, okay, that's great. And then as I read the article, I thought, brilliant, this is in Longbenton, Julia's going to be there in Newcastle like a shot, so we can have a full debrief. And I thought a really interesting location to choose, really, as well for the trial format. And really interesting that it's not overtly the Iceland footprint, is it? But then they've got so much goodwill in industry and from a good base of customers, which they've grown significantly over the last 12 months, to go with a totally different name and a totally different look and feel. It is really fascinating and ballsy. And they are, aren't they? And we like that about them.
Nora, what's your first pick for us?
My first pick this week is from the Sunday Times, and this is about Amazon. And the reason I picked this, we've obviously heard so much about Amazon over the last couple of weeks, and their new format in Ealing. And it's the news the Sunday Times have broken about Amazon trademarking Amazon Pharmacy, and they've put an application into the Intellectual Property Office. And basically, the Times is saying that, is this signalling Amazon moving into the prescription market? And they've disrupted the $300 billion industry in the US. The industry in the US is quite different in terms of pharmacy market. It's not regulated the same way that the UK is. And they trade very much on speed of delivery on the online service. In the article, it talks about in America, Amazon have a direct challenger to major players, Walgreens, as we know, owned by Boots, and CVS, that they've heavily challenged and have discounts of up to 80% for generic drugs and 40% for branded medicines. The article then goes on to talk about, unsurprisingly, service. And this is one of the reasons I wanted to pick this. And, you know, we're going to see this time and time again over different retailers. You can get so much more online now, but what is the point of going to a store? And I suppose that's very much the same for a pharmacy. And there's a quote from the Association of Independent Multiple Pharmacies talking about, you need to diagnose people properly, and if people have long-term conditions, it's really important that they talk to a pharmacist first. And I think the NHS have really pushed, haven't they, over the last decade or so, putting pharmacists at the front line of healthcare, particularly in the UK. So the article then also goes on to say the online pharmacy services in the UK have grown significantly by Pharmacy to You, which uses a subscription model and has over 500,000 customers. And they posted sales of almost 80 million to the end of March last year. So I guess I was interested from the Amazon perspective, and their march never stops. They keep on going, and Jeff Bezos's day one mentality is still very much there. And also more broadly into the service element and the requirements of people, be that in pharmacies and retail more broadly. What are your thoughts, Jack? And will small independent and bigger players like Boots still have very much a role to play? Or actually, if you're an individual and you've been prescribed something, actually it's easy because you're going to get it at your door in 2 days if you're an Amazon Prime customer?
Yeah, I think what it comes down to is there's two different consumer decisions when you're going into the place. I mean, if it's about convenience, I mean, Amazon's going to win every single time. I mean, they are the specialists in it. Speed, convenience, as you say, it's going to be there the next day. It's exciting. That's brilliant. If you have an issue, you can get something really quickly. But yeah, I suppose the other side of pharmacies is that you might be going in for something a little bit more private, and you want that linked to the rest of your Amazon data and coming up in all of your recommendations for the next couple of weeks or for the rest of your life. I think the privacy side might deter people, and the other thing that pharmacies are able to offer is having a specialist in there. I said, no, there's services that they're able to provide that Amazon, could do in certain ways, but it's just different from the personal touch. I mean, as you said, I mean, US pharmacies are dramatically different and would look a lot more, to us, in this part of the world, would look a lot more like a supermarket rather than a pharmacy. So I think that the services that pharmacies offer in the UK and Ireland is a little bit different. So I think in that sense, Amazon might struggle to compete with them on that level. Aside from the consumers who are just looking for pure convenience, I think that stuff will be taken over by Amazon. But for all those additional services, I think you need the human interaction, human touch that you get from walking into one of those other chains that you mentioned.
I don't know. I think this is a sector that's really ripe for disruption, and I agree that the point you raise about privacy concerns and how does my prescription data potentially feed into my wider Amazon purchase history. I think that's definitely something they'd want to be really, really clear on. But I think we're seeing quite a bit of a sort of evolution of these types of services already. You can now get online dermatology services that are actually really good, and they do consultation over Zoom, and they give you a personalized prescription. So I think that element of personal service and advice, absolutely, that is part of what we expect when we go to a chemist. But that doesn't necessarily need to be store based. And I think if Amazon combine what they're offering here, the slick logistics that we would expect from Amazon, but then perhaps also link that with some of these consultation services that are running online, I think there is quite a bit of disruption to be done, because I think a lot of the shopping experience or general sort of service experience of going to chemists is quite patchy. Some are great and you get fantastic level of service and you go into really nice stores as well and it's a pleasant experience. But some of these stores are really tired and they're tiny and the range isn't that great. And if it's a fairly transactional interaction where you're just picking up your prescription, why wouldn't you get it delivered to your door? I wouldn't. I can see quite a bit of potential. So it'll be really, really interesting to see if they do actually decide to go ahead with this in the UK. Jack, tell us about your second article.
From the Atlantic, and it's from I think the journalist has been featured on the podcast before. It's Amanda Mull, who wrote a piece maybe a couple of months ago as well, that was featured on. So her article this week is that she said the article is called "No Real Reason to Eat 3 Meals per Day." She's pretty good on the big trend stuff that's going on over in America, and basically she's trying to break down what's going on over there following on the pandemic, and saying the pandemic habits that people have formed around eating are starting to develop in a way that's going to change how Americans consume food, or a lot of Americans consume food, even when people go back to work. It's an interesting and a broad historical argument that brings up, why do we eat 3 meals a day? And she's saying it's a lot to do with the industrialization that took place over 150 years ago, that becomes very ingrained and hasn't been disrupted in a long time. And saying that because of the pandemic, people are eating at home all the time, and that for people who should have been eating little and often and have maybe different eating behaviors, different patterns, that they've been onto the 3 meals a day system because that's the way their work was set up. And now they're onto this different system that they're going to start to change their consumer behaviors, which then changes what style of food that they're going to eat. And it's making the case that it's going to change grocery retail as well as restaurant. And I know it's something that we are focusing on here, is looking more and more at little dishes, looking at what people are going to eat and look at what people are going to graze on in the veg world, rather than necessarily having, for us as a side dish company to reflect on. It's us reflecting, what are we sitting on the side of? And will it now be a case where people are consuming maybe 4 to 5 side dishes rather than having one big main in the middle of it with the sides, and having, the difference between if people are consuming one big evening meal or even one big meal in the middle of the day, where does their big meal sit? Or even does that big meal become the central focus of the day? So she's bringing all of this to the fore. I mean, it doesn't really have any answers to it, but throws up a lot of questions.
I love this article. It really resonated with me because I'm going to make a revelation here. I don't eat breakfast anymore. So for the last year, I've stopped eating breakfast, really, because I'm sat at home all the time. And if I have 3 meals a day, I'm going to be the size of an absolute house. So I think if I don't start eating till lunchtime, then I can pretty much get away with eating what I want, although I still have collected a few pounds over lockdown. And so I was really intrigued by this. And other comments it made in the article, is you've alluded to, is about biohacking biohacking, and how biohacking really is the cool term for not having breakfast. And I don't know if it's just me, but I'm noticing a lot more on Instagram in particular, folks talking about, how to, lower your blood glucose levels, how to, as you talk about there, Jack, about having different meals, stopping eating, as the article says, at 6 p.m, and, making sure that you're getting good sleep, and all of this protecting your gut, and all of this connecting with I guess the golden thread to what we've been chatting about so far is data. We've got better data because a lot of us are sat with Apple Watches or whatever devices around our wrists, so knowing how we've slept, what time we've eaten, you may be putting it into MyFitnessPal, you're using all this stuff. So I just feel as well, we're just so much more aware of what we're putting in our bodies. And maybe, I'm still, don't worry, I'm still eating plenty of biscuits, so there's still a lot of that going on, but I'm just probably more aware of it. And it's really interesting, this article shaking things up, because I'm thinking, well, I don't need to be eating the carbs on a morning, because I'm going to save and have them in the afternoon instead. What do you think, Julia? Are you still eating breakfast?
I am still eating breakfast. I'm loyal to my porridge. But I think that's so interesting. And what you were just saying about skipping breakfast, because I suppose, I don't know whether this is sort of part of an intermittent fasting kind of regime or something like that, which obviously feeds into the sort of biohacking side. But yeah, I guess once you sort of start challenging some of these conventions, maybe you don't need to stick to that pattern. But also, company like yours, Jack, can suddenly start playing at breakfast potentially, because if you're starting to kind of redefine what you're expecting at certain for certain meals, this idea that there are specific breakfast foods, I mean, that is sort of a relatively modern invention, and something that's sort of largely branding and marketing driven. So yeah, I think the idea that sort of gets explored in this article, that once you start shaking up your habits, almost anything is up for grabs. It'll be fascinating to see how much of that actually does stick. I mean, I think the idea that, I don't know, perhaps it's slightly different in the US, but the idea that we're going to dramatically move away from that sort of 3 meals a day pattern feels a little bit far-fetched. But I think it's a really, really interesting argument, and I can see that there would be pockets of consumer groups where actually the behavior looks very, very different to what we've seen in the past.
I mean, it definitely, for us in the food industry, it seems really strange, because the food industry is one of those ones that's had to, certainly food manufacturing, keep going. So we've all stuck to so many of our patterns, and then to suddenly see people saying, "Oh, well, you've been doing this, we've been, everything over here has changed really dramatically." It kind of catches us in the back foot, going, "Oh wow, when things reopen, is a lot going to be really different, or are we reading a lot of press that's telling us maybe things are going to be different, and actually we're going to go back and things are going to be relatively the same?"
Julia, what's your second pick this week?
My second pick this week is from The Spoon, and it's called "Could Food Companies Cash In on NFTs?" NFTs are non-fungible tokens, and they have been everywhere of late. Lots and lots of media coverage because a digital artist known as Beeple has just sold an NFT through an auction at Christie's for $69 million. And I thought, well, I've been reading quite a bit about NFTs. I really don't get it. This is quite a difficult concept to get your head around. So I was grateful that The Spoon decided to write about this and explore the significance of NFTs in a food context, which meant I had an excuse to talk to you both about this. NFTs, as The Spoon explains, are a way to use blockchain technology to create scarcity and value around digital goods. It's not a million miles from something like a limited edition, but for digital stuff. You basically have digital files that are secured via blockchain and that can be used to verify ownership of a work of digital art, for example. And if you're the artist, you can use those NFTs to limit the number of original digital items that are then available for purchase. The tricky bit, I suppose, is the fact that anyone can still make copies of that artwork for free, and because it's digital, those copies are essentially going to be just as good as the original. They just don't come with that validation that says you own one of those validated copies. So in many ways, what you're getting with the NFT system is, as the article says, simply bragging rights, which doesn't feel massively intuitive if you are not immersed in that side of the art market, or even that side of the technology market. It certainly doesn't feel massively intuitive to me. But the reason the Spoon is thinking about NFTs in a food context is because Taco Bell has released its own digital art via NFTs. And so that's prompted the author of the article, Chris Albrecht, to wonder if there are perhaps wider applications for NFTs in and around food. And he's identified 4 areas where he thinks they could potentially play a part around sort of brand building and brand awareness and potentially marketing efforts. The first area he identifies is recipes. So he's raising the question, could there be a market for limited edition original recipes from famous chefs, for example, that could then be sold via NFTs? Menus are another option he flags up. There is apparently a thriving market of menu collectors out there. I wasn't aware of that. Again, people collecting physical items. Could NFTs open this up to a wider market and allow restaurants to sell digital originals of special menus they've created, for example? Then there's high-end food photography. Again, you can get physical prints that fetch some fairly high prices at the moment. Could you potentially have collectors looking to acquire digital rights, or could you use NFTs to be used to make these images more affordable to a wider range of people than is possible with the physical prints? And finally, wine. He raises quite an interesting prospect of wineries and vineyards potentially creating digital corks that could accompany particularly fancy bottles of wine. So you have that sort of added element, something extra special to kind of reinforce the specialness of your purchase, if you will. I have to say, as fascinating as it is, none of it still makes intuitive sense to me. I am still looking at this going, I don't understand why someone would be spending money on this, but I think it's really interesting to explore how some of this technology could play out in our industry. And it's clearly captured the public imagination. And I think very interesting to see that a brand like Taco Bell has jumped on this. It's a publicity stunt, of course, but it does take a pretty switched on marketing team to be able to identify something like this and then, be able to react so quickly and release your own digital art via NFTs. They've managed to get loads of publicity as a result as well and position themselves around a cutting edge topic, I guess, that they wouldn't normally be associated with. So yes, fascinating, but I have to say I'm still probably as confused as I was before. Jack, what did you make of it?
I have to say I hadn't heard a huge amount about NFTs until the last couple of weeks, and then all of a sudden there seems to be this huge buzz around it. I mean, I understand, I think, the basic premise, which to me is like collecting football stickers when you're a kid, and it's you've got the shinies and you've got the ones that you can't replicate, and it all makes sense. And then when it comes to this level, whenever people are spending that kind of money on art or on Jack Dorsey's first tweet, it just seems I don't get that. It just seems to have gone to a level that's beyond. And I think when it comes to the food industry, food and drink in particular, it's all about it's all about the consumption. It's all about having that moment of happiness when you're eating the food or enjoying the food. And don't get me wrong, Instagram's amazing for pictures of people enjoying food. And I suppose what they're getting, the credence they're getting out of that, and the added value is the exclusivity of being seen to be in that restaurant consuming that food. I'm not sure how NFTs can replicate that. I'm sure somebody will find a way to monetize it. I just struggle to see how NFTs can replicate the joy of eating food and the exclusivity that comes with some food and wine around the world. I mean, the digital cork idea, is there any way to replicate having the physical presence of the cork in your hand by having a digital cork? I don't know. There's just something that, to me, coming from I suppose a farm background here, there's something tangible about food that I just don't think can be in any way recreated.
Laura, what's your second pick?
My second pick this week is from the Retail Gazette, and it's news about Pret. Pret strikes a deal to sell baked treats in Tesco stores, and it's had quite a bit of coverage actually this week. And they've struck this deal to get frozen croissants for baking at home sold across 700 of Tesco stores. And there's also talk in the article about dressings and sauces are under consideration to be sold through the supermarkets going forwards. And it talks about this is a deal to adapt Pret Pret to a new normal and counteract the lockdown effects, and the fact that Pret's hoping to win new customers ahead of planned sites to be opened in suburban areas, I guess, in the forthcoming months. Last September, Pret launched a subscription service for drinks, which allows customers to have drinks prepared 5 times a day for £20 a month. And I guess one of the reasons I picked this article, that we've had news this week of Thornton's stores not going to reopen after lockdown and when restrictions lift, and Greggs have played heavily in the retail space, putting their products into frozen into the supermarkets, and Pizza Express have done similar. Thorntons have done it in such a heavy way. Has that actually devalued their brand, and do they need to reopen their stores? And I guess that was my same thinking for Pret, really. I suppose they need to do this. They need to mix up their portfolio and to get some more of a retail footing. And it's always that balancing act, isn't it, about how far do you go, and do you go as far as Thorntons have and lose that exclusivity, and you can pick up a box of Thorntons chocolates in your local off license now, and rather than going to a dedicated store, and they don't need those anymore. And will this feel so different? And also, I guess the other reason I picked it, I'm a massive Pret fan. So me saying I haven't done breakfast for a year, I haven't done breakfast because I haven't been near a Pret. I think that's probably the reason. So I'd be picking up a croissant and a bit of porridge from Pret. Do I want to be going to the frozen section and baking them in my oven at home? So it threw up a lot of questions, really, and it's about getting that balance right. What are your thoughts, Jack, and how far should brands be going in terms of giving their name to products in a supermarket when they're a food service retailer at heart?
Yeah, Laura, I mean, I'm entirely with you. I'm a huge Pret fan. I suppose I lived in the south of England for 7 years, and then moved back to Northern Ireland again. So I'm well accustomed to missing Pret, and I've been missing it for quite a long time. So I'm completely with you on that. Whether or not it'll carry through, I mean, one of the things I thought was interesting is the products that they're going to do in the supermarkets. Having frozen croissants, I mean, definitely. I mean, I when I think of Pret, I think of croissants, definitely. But it's not getting into their core goods, and they're already doing their coffee in a sense elsewhere. I'll be interested to see just how their coffee's been performing, and if it's something that they want to go forward with after on the other end of this. Do they want to keep doing that, and does it start to devalue their brand a bit? I think it's a really interesting point, because their brand, I think Julia would agree. Everyone on this call is a big fan of Pret. Whether or not that's replicated by frozen croissants, I'm not sure. Yeah, it'd be interesting to see how they get on. You see other brands do it really successfully. I think Nando's is an example of someone who's moved into the grocery section, hasn't devalued them. It's actually increased their brand presence, and they've done a phenomenal job of expanding. And I think they've continued to do it with the recession. It'd be interesting to see if lots of companies that do it for meal opportunities for dinner and for supper can do this then for the breakfast products as well.
Definitely a big fan of Pret as well. And yeah, I probably haven't had anything from Pret in about a year as well. So I can't wait for that to be possible again. I think, Jack, what you were saying about choosing the right products and making sure that core offering isn't cannibalized, I think that's probably key. And yes, croissants are an important part of the offering, but I think it's really the sandwich range and the lunchtime offering, I think, where Pret has such a point of difference. And they're not doing that yet. And I don't know if they're planning to. So I think that would be, if you started having Pret branded sandwiches and baguettes and meatballs, sarnies or whatever in supermarkets, I think then you are potentially really, really losing a reason for shoppers to still be going into your stores. I think croissants, and especially in frozen, I think that's quite a sort of narrow way to try that. And I was also thinking, I think Nando's is such a good example of a brand that's done this really well. I think Leon has also been really gutsy in pushing into retail, and again, because they focused on condiments and really great packaging and really great branding, I think they have managed, my impression is at least, to offer a really authentic Leon experience. without taking away a reason to visit a Leon store later, because you're not getting the actual product you're buying. You're not getting the meal, you're just getting some accessories around it that allow you to sort of replicate some of that experience. So I feel like they have potentially created a footprint, those sorts of brands that show how it is possible. But yeah, it'd be so interesting to see whether we are actually going to see some Pret branded food to go products at some point soon. I guess it'll depend on how high streets recover and what footfall looks like once we see restrictions lift. Jack, it's been great to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for having me on St. Patrick's Day. It feels like to be on the show as well, and hopefully I'll be able to find somewhere that you'll do some takeaway Guinness or something like that later on this evening.
We've loved it. Thank you.
That's all we have for you this week. Thank you so much for listening.
You can find links to the articles we discussed in the show notes at thepicklist.co.uk.
If you enjoyed our show, please subscribe, give it a rating and leave a review. It makes a massive difference to our podcast and helps us reach more people in the food industry who'd enjoy listening to The Pick List.
Thanks again for listening. See you next time.